consensus is A, we must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents, it doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society.
Never again should Washington put politics and party above law and order.
It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I want to ask, what made them do this? They must be taken off the street.
From this day forward, let us put partisanship behind us, and let us go forward, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, law enforcement, community leaders, ordinary citizens. Let us roll up our sleeves to roll back this awful tide of violence and reduce crime in our country. We have the tools now. Let us get about the business of using them.
The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, or, as you may know it, the 1994 Crime Bill, was hailed as a solution to snuff out the crime problem. This piece of legislation, depending on who you ask, was just what the people needed. It was the government finally doing something about crime. It was bipartisan, and it was proof that even Democrats weren't afraid to lock people up. Crime did fall, but it didn't fall gracefully. And quiet as it's kept, it was slowly starting to decline even before the bill was passed. But like many policies before it, the bill was not without consequences, and today we are still living amidst the negative impacts that are too often just dismissed as collateral damage. To understand why the bill was needed in the first place, we must take a few steps back. At what point do we just give up on each other? When, as a society, is it okay to say enough is enough and accept that in our hearts some people are beyond saving? Some people are so depraved and maladapted that we don't need to understand why they are the way they are. We just need to get them off the streets and behind bars. When is it okay to admit that some people are super predators? In the early 1990s, America reached this point. People were willing to sacrifice their neighbors, friends, and children just to make the chaos stop. And at that time, the people who the nation deemed fit this description of these heinous crimes were overwhelmingly poor, Black, and desperate. Despite the anxiety-inducing news cycle that you witness today, crime is but a fraction of what it was in the early 1990s. The difference is that now there's a 24/7 bombardment of everything happening in the country, and that's in the palm of our hands via social media. This includes violent crime. The Pew Research Center looked at data from the FBI and found that violent crime saw a 71% decrease from 1993 to 2022. 1993 ended with 23,182 reported homicides that year alone, compared to 18,460 homicides in 2023. Mind you, there were almost 74 million less people in the country in 1993. Crime didn't just randomly skyrocket out of nowhere. The truth is, this wave of crime was decades in the making. In the 1920s, the country was just a few years removed from the First World War. Then there was a resurgence of the KKK and conservatism. Alcohol became illegal, which was known as prohibition, which led to bootleggers, which led to crime. And by the 1930s, crime seemed like the only real option because the Great Depression was in full swing and people were as desperate and hungry as ever. Opportunities were limited for everyone, but especially for non-whites who were still under the thumb of discrimination and segregation, all while dealing with the economy collapsing. And then there was World War II, nearly 70 nations in conflict with each other at one time. After the defeat of the Nazis and the dropping of the atomic bombs, people in America were feeling very nationalistic. They had these tendencies that led them to be incredibly patriotic. And while the country seemed to be making strides socially and morally, attitudes around race, religion, family values, and gender had not really changed. Jim Crow laws and segregation still very much so governed the South well into the 60s. Determined to keep fighting for justice, we started to see a rise of several progressive movements in the country. This led to a divided country, again, those who wanted the old America of the past and those who wanted to push America into the future. The psyche of America was in shambles, and drugs became an appealing way to cope, and also an easy way to put people in prison. Those slipping deeper into addiction turned to crime to avoid their withdrawal. Those making money off of the product were already committing a crime, but had to resort to violent measures to keep competitors from creeping in. In October of 1970, Richard Nixon passed the Organized Crime Control Act to address this problem, to punish the people bringing these drugs into our communities. But it wasn't enough, and crime only continued to rise. And by 1973, the country was entering into yet another recession. Unemployment would reach almost 9% by 1975. The economy struggled to rebound, and by the 1980s, inflation was over 11%, while the unemployment rate stayed high. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, in 1981, Ronald Reagan's presidency began, and his focus was stripping social programs, criticizing those on welfare, working against union protests, and promoting the idea of sink or swim when it came to making your way in America, all while funding an illegal war in Nicaragua. See, Nicaragua was in conflict. The communist Sandinistas had taken control of the government, and a group known as the Contras were attempting to fight back, and Reagan was determined to help them, even if Congress did not approve. And Congress has good reason not to approve. They believe the Contras were involved in the drug trade, particularly cocaine. And by the mid-1980s, there was such an excess of cocaine in the United States as a result. And then crack hit the scene. It was so addictive that people were willing to do unimaginable things to get high, and drug dealers were making millions when they were previously standing in the ever-growing unemployment line. And they were willing to do anything to protect this newfound wealth, including killing their neighbors. No one was safe. Communities that were already struggling got hit the hardest. And so now we arrive back to the 1990s, literally the highest rate of violent crime this country has ever seen. Most police were either too afraid or too corrupt to act in any meaningful way. The public was being smothered and their cries muffled. So the people were desperate. On April 29, 1994, a little boy by the name of James Darby wrote letters to President Bill Clinton, along with his class. His letter read, quote, "Dear Mr. Clinton, I want you to stop the killing in the city. I think somebody might kill me. I'm asking you nicely to stop it. I know you can do it." Unquote. James was killed on Mother's Day of that same year after an altercation escalated at the park where he was an innocent bystander. Ironically, his shooter was a victim of gun violence themselves. The community was starved for answers, so they were willing to say yes to whatever solution was fed to them. Senator Joe Biden insisted that he had the solution to prevent tragedies like these that were all too common. At the time, Biden was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He personally worked with the police for several hundred hours on the bill over the course of 5 years. Dozens of meetings and speeches, and pleading with his fellow Democrats to see the vision and to reassure to Republicans that the bill would be enough. President Clinton was desperate for the bill, even calling Joe at all hours about it. The Congressional Black Caucus cautiously got on board. 26 of the 38 members voted in favor of the bill. At the time, they just wanted something to be done about the crime. Those who were concerned felt like the bill did not properly support crime prevention. Both sides had no idea just how disproportionate policing would be for their own community. Everyone was waiting to see if Clinton was going to make good on his promises to fix the crime problem. And out of this, we get the notorious 1994 crime bill, which was 356 pages long. And there's a lot to unpack. For starters, it wasn't all bad. One section included the federal assault weapons ban. Mass shootings were beginning to become an issue in the country. Just the year before the bill was signed, there were 47 school shootings, a new high for the country, which is small compared to what we know today. And 5 years later, we'd get the Columbine school shooting, perhaps the most notorious school shooting in American history, and the shooting that inspired more mass shootings that we would see over the course of the next several decades. The effectiveness of the ban is up for debate. It resulted in about a 17% decrease, according to the National Institute of Justice at the Department of Justice, where the ban was lifted in 2004. Congress had the option to vote to continue it, but didn't. The Violence Against Women's Act was also tied to the bill, which helped protect and provide resources to victims of rape and domestic violence. Before the funding this bill provided, battered women's shelters nationwide were without funding, and there were reports that some shelters were literally selling brownies and cookies just to stay afloat. Lastly, the bill set aside funds for crime prevention and grants for programs like the Boys and Girls Club and Midnight Sports League programs designed to allow kids to have fun and exercise instead of running the streets in the evening. The first part to put this plan into action was an increased police force. 100,000 new officers equipped with training and weapons, helicopters, new artillery, and the police forces nationwide started to look more like the ones we see today. The community-oriented police services, known as COPS, was added to the Department of Justice and would cost a whopping $8.8 billion. This organization still exists today. Their aim is to work with the community to create a safer environment for everyone. Increased policing also meant that there would need to be places to put all of these people who would be arrested, and that would cost another $12.5 billion. These funds were given to the states to build more prisons and more cells to hold the violent criminals that were expected to fill them, and on average would build one new prison every 15 days. New standards declared that those incarcerated had to serve at least 80% of their sentences. These were called truth in sentencing laws that would make sure that those in prison stayed there. These laws addressed the public's fear of violent criminals being released early on good behavior, only to carry out more crime. This wasn't all. There was also mandatory minimums now. Regardless of how a judge felt about a case, they had to deliver the minimum sentence even if it seemed harsh for the situation. At a glance, this may seem fair as it relates to violent crime, but violent crime isn't always what you think it is. Murder, rape, robbery, assault, etc. are the ones that probably come to mind first. They are straightforward, but something like car theft, a physical fight over a disagreement, or burglary all fell under violent crime. So you see where things could get murky here. The list of charges that could result in the death penalty increased by 60, including non-homicidal narcotic offenses. And then one of the most distinct features was the idea of 3 strikes and you're out. Yes, like baseball, only now we were playing games with people's lives. 3 serious felonies and someone could find themselves looking at 25 years to life. Where it gets messy is how a state defined serious, and serious did not always mean violent. The thing about this bill is that it started to leave so many serious things up to the government's discretion. The unfortunate part is for these repeat offenders, no one was asking why they kept coming back and why they kept choosing a life of crime. The solution was always just to lock them away and forget about them. Once incarcerated, there were no longer Pell Grants available for any inmates looking for assistance to pay for their degree in college. This remained until 2023. With the increased police presence, it wasn't just violent criminals that got in trouble. Many people were stopped for even the most minor traffic violations, and police often took the opportunity to search the car. Rarely were any guns or large amounts of drugs actually recovered. Too often, police came up empty-handed, so their stops were baseless. But if they did find something like a small amount of drugs for personal use, an arrest was likely. Even if the charges were later dismissed, those arrests could still show up on people's records. And keep in mind, during this time, 5 grams of crack could get you a minimum of 5 years in jail. In the Crack Cocaine Corruption and Conspiracy documentary, they explained that this is equivalent to about 5 sugar packets. This meant not only drug dealers, but drug users would wound up in prison when they should have been in rehab. To make matters worse, after the dust settled, most of the arrests that would come from the new initiatives that this bill proposed were black people, which is odd considering that 2/3 of crack users were white. By 1995, 134,000 black people sat in prison, which was over 7 times the amount 10 years prior. The over-policing also meant more children ended up in juvenile detention or even adult prisons. This is because even today, some states like New York or Nevada would consider even a 13-year-old an adult, depending on the charges. And today, we are living in the aftermath of that. Just 30 years removed, there are young adults whose parents are just getting out of prison because of crimes they committed in the 90s and the early 2000s. Rehabilitation within the prison system are a thing of the past. Reports from the United States Sentencing Commission show that half of the people released from prison and almost 25% of people released from jail will end up right back there within 8 years. And most of those offenses occur within 2 years of being released, because in reality, there are more barriers to rehabilitation post-incarceration than there are resources. And if you've ever wondered how American high schools ended up with school resource officers or SROs, You know, the police presence you see in so many public schools across the country, this bill paved the way for an increased police presence in schools. Today, the system of mass incarceration just generates too much money for the powers that be to be serious about any type of reform. And we aren't just talking about for-profit prisons. On average, those only make up less than 10% of the prisons. Running a prison is like running a tiny town, and everything in that space needs suppliers. Commissary is a billion-dollar industry. Bail bondsmen, even the phone calls to speak with family members bring in millions. Then there's free labor. According to the 13th Amendment, slavery is allowed to be used as a punishment for a crime. Look it up for yourself. Just how many of your favorite businesses have prison labor in their supply chain? There are currently over 2 million people incarcerated in America. There were 1.3 million people incarcerated when Bill Clinton left office. 664,000 people were incarcerated when Reagan left office, and 216,000 under Nixon. The scary part is the next generation of prisoners are already being accounted for. The question isn't, how much did the 1994 crime bill benefit? The real question is, how much damage did it do? And are these people that we're throwing in prisons just cheap labor? Are they just a means to an end? Are they beyond the pale like the generation before them who sat in prison? And if they aren't, when do we learn of the past mistakes of something like the 1994 crime bill and start challenging ourselves to get to the root of why crime happens in the first place?